Hello, fellow anti-novelists and friends. A final installment coming at you from the ranch on the 4-act story structure. First, congratulations! You have made it all the way through the 4-act story structure. So let's dive right in, wrap up the 4th act, and then I've got some bonus tools to share with you. So let's get into it. In Act 4, you're coming off of the discoveries that took place in Act 3, which we've already talked about, is speeding up and pulling your reader through to the end of your story. Generally, Act 4 is the shortest act of the novel. It's action-packed, fast-paced. It's all about getting that reader through the story and landing them on a satisfying ending. So, first note here says, a discovery pushes the main character back into action with renewed vigor. Okay, so this is where things are happening that are energizing that main character, thereby dragging your reader right into the fray to get to the end, to get to the satisfying conclusion. So out of the 3rd plot point, that tragedy, that disaster, whatever that conflict is, creates the ashes from which your character is going to rise here in the 4th act. You're wrapping up your subplots. We talked about in Acts 2 and 3, getting those subplot threads developed. Here's where you're wrapping those up. We have mounting forces, momentum towards the final battle. I've got notes that say gather forces, go harder, increasing tension. This is where it needs to be unbearable for your reader to even think about putting the book down because they want to drive to the finish. Clues begin coming together. Reader is learning what's actually going on. And this is cool. A pro bonus tip is if you can clue the reader in to what's really going on, what's really happening, what's really coming together before the character figures it out, huge bonus. Readers love those little cookies so that they can figure things out first. This is where your forces are mounting against your main character. This is where your main character is going to formulate their final plan, okay? They're formulating their journey to the big ending. So they're going to seize the sword. Sometimes it's called storming the castle, right? This is getting ready to take control and solve this story. I've got moment it all began, marching into the enemy's lair, facing their greatest fears. So a key component of Act 4 is keeping in mind what is your character's wound, what is their misbelief about the world, and how are you going to tie all of that into how you resolve your story. Because remember, we've gone on a journey with you and with this character, and we want all of that stuff tied up into a nice, neat bow that brings us to the end. So they need to confront whatever their lie is about themselves and the world, and they need to work out whatever their wound is and come out on the other side a better, more whole person, a better character. I've made a note here that this could be another set piece. I'm going to answer over in Q&A the distinction between movies and written fiction. I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say we should not use movies, screenplays as a metric by which to measure our fiction, but let's put a pin in that because I'll talk about that later and explain why that's my opinion. So this is where you're seeing big visuals, landscapes, panoramas. You want to establish a big view for your reader that just gives them the gravity of this final scene. You want to balance the inevitable as if the story had to go here. There's no other place this story could have gone. With the unexpected, the holy cow, I never expected that. This is where you're going to put in your twist. You're going to put in some surprise revelations. This is where you really woo your reader and make them love your story. At 80%, the villain gains the advantage. Now, again, these percentages are just suggestions based on good novels. So use them as a guideline, use them as metrics to make sure that you're moving your story forward in a even way. Biggest setback yet. It can be physical and or it can be mental. So this is where you really whack your character. This is another place potentially for a black moment. It's right before your main character goes through their transformation. They're realizing their greatest fears and they know now they absolutely must change. We've got a devastating event. Something terrible goes wrong, forces them to change. Okay, detail out. Do they lose their weapon? Is there a twist? Is everything lost here? This is where you throw your final bag of tricks at that character, forcing them to push to the resolution. I've highlighted and washi taped the final battle, battle number 3. The resolution should refute or relate to the mirror moment, which is what you had at the midpoint, as well as the earlier character's wound and lie or misbelief about their world. This is where you tie everything together and they have their aha moment. This is where their old self dies and they're birthing their new self. This must seem inevitable, okay? There's no way out of making this change, this growth pattern, and they're only going to do this once. I've mentioned before, characters should only go through a set of problems, solve an issue, a wound about themselves one time. Readers don't want to see them go back and do it again and again. But the important thing about this birth of the new self is it must seem inevitable. Your reader needs to feel like this is exactly where this story needed to go. So this third battle ends the primary conflict with the antagonist, and I've labeled it the local or the arch antagonist. If you're working in a series of books, you may have an arch antagonist, which is a high level, maybe a systemic, an organizational, some kind of higher level antagonist that's going to play through all of the series of books. And then you may have a more local antagonist, more of a low-level bad guy, or it could even be an antagonist by proxy. Maybe it's something to do with the weather. It's an attitude that needs to change. There's a lot of things, and we'll talk about different kinds of antagonists later, but there's a lot of things that you can use to end this primary conflict. I've made a note to play the Q factor. The Q factor is a little shorthand taken from James Bond, where early on in the story, generally somewhere in Act 1, you're going to plant something, okay? It's an emotional impetus to change, and it connects with a trigger. Like here in this final battle, the words of the mentor from back in Act 1 come back to your character, or they touch or grab onto that sentimental object, and it gives them the final thrust to push on through. So the Q factor is something that you recall, that you call back in this act to give your character that final strength. I've got another note that says that they are most powerful when the main character embraces who they needed to become, okay? So this is where your character steps into their new self. I've made a little reminder note about James Scott Bell's pyramid. Where did your character start? Where were they in the midpoint? And where did they get to in the climax that it gives up their old self in order to embrace their new self? And then we have the resolution highlighted, how the main character's life changes. Often you have an epilogue here, or you have a sequel. You're tying up all the rest of the loose ends. It's a little denouement. It's just a little finishing up piece. And often, dun dun dun, this is where you have the hook that takes your reader into the next book. And we're going to talk about how to develop that. So that is a high-level overview of Act 4. That brings us through the entire story. So my hope is that now you are ready to get cracking on your own stories. So what I'm going to link for you below is number 1, it's the plot cheat sheet. It's one sheet that has all of the plot beats. It's got the percentages of story, and it's just a quick sketchbook, right? This is where you're going to sketch out what scene is going to be my meet the hero, or what scene is going to be my inciting incident. And then what does that conflict look like? And then what does that sequel look like? You're basically just talking to yourself the same way that you did in the cause and effect worksheet, but this just allows you one slick page to start sketching out the entirety of your story at a high level. The second thing I'm giving you is the conflict matrix. Down the left-hand margin, I've got about 70 different kinds of conflicts. And across the top, I've got who those conflicts could occur with between them and your character, okay? So they may be, there may be an adoption or learning the truth about it that happens with a spouse, all right? So see how that works? That's how you're going to figure out how do you want to move your story forward and what kinds of conflicts might play in to push that character. So thank you so much for sticking with me for all 4 segments. Next, we're going to launch into the individual plot beats and plot points, and we're going to start filling out these worksheets and really getting down to the grass level view of how to write, create, edit, and keep working on your own stories. So thank you so much for your time. I'll see you in the next video.